It is 5:30 on a winter morning in 1756, and Vienna lies silent beneath a coat of fresh snow. The sun will not rise for another 2 hours. The city's inhabitants sleep, wrapped in wool and shadow, their breath forming clouds in unheated rooms. But at Schönbrunn Palace, 3 kilometers to the west, the darkness already moves with purpose. In the basement corridors where no daylight is ever reached, a stoker named Johann Meyer descends a worn stone staircase, his lantern casting a dancing circle of gold against walls black with decades of soot. He is 43 years old. His hands are calloused from handling coal and wood since he was 14. He has worked in this palace for 19 years, and he has never once set foot in any of its grand state rooms. He has never seen the great gallery where dignitaries will dance tonight. He has never glimpsed the Chinese round cabinet where the Empress conducts her most private meetings. He knows the palace only from below, from the maze of tunnels and heating chambers where men like him labor in shifts around the clock to keep the vast machine of imperial life from grinding to a halt. Johann carries with him a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth, his breakfast, and a flask of thin beer. His shift will last 12 hours. By the time he emerges, the sun will have risen, crossed the sky, and begun its descent. The nobles upstairs will have woken to warm rooms, dressed in clothes laid out by servants, eaten meals prepared in kitchens he has also never seen. They will walk through heated corridors, conduct business in chambers kept at precisely the right temperature, and retire to beds warmed by copper pans filled with hot coals. And they will not think of Johann Meyer. They will not think of the 73 other stokers who work in rotation to maintain the palace's 239 stoves. They will not think of the tons of wood consumed each day, the mountains of ash that must be carried out before dawn, the burns and the smoke-damaged lungs, the children who grew up without fathers present because those fathers were always below, always feeding the fires that kept the empire warm. This is the story that does not get told when we speak of palaces. We speak of architecture and art, of emperors and empresses, of grand balls and political intrigue. We speak of beauty, and Schönbrunn is beautiful, astonishingly, almost unbearably beautiful. Its yellow ochre facade stretches for nearly 200 meters along its principal front, a symphony of baroque precision painted in the color that would come to be known throughout Europe simply as Schönbrunn yellow. Its gardens extend across nearly 200 hectares, comprising formal parterres, geometric pathways, towering hedge walls, hidden fountains, Roman ruins constructed as deliberate artifice, and the great gloriette standing atop its hill like a crown upon the landscape. But beauty of this magnitude is not natural. It does not simply exist. It must be created, and then, far more difficult, it must be maintained. The truth that empires prefer to forget is that splendor is expensive. Not expensive in the abstract theoretical way that we might casually acknowledge, but expensive in concrete, daily, grinding reality. Every candle burned in a chandelier must be manufactured from rendered animal fat, shipped to the palace, stored in cool, dry rooms, distributed to the appropriate chambers, replaced when spent, and the wax drippings collected and reprocessed. Every fire that warms a room requires wood to be felled in distant forests, transported by cart and river barge, unloaded by laborers, split and stacked and dried, carried to the correct heating chamber, burned at the correct rate, and the ashes disposed of before they accumulate. Every meal served requires ingredients sourced from across the empire, prepared by armies of cooks and kitchen staff, plated on porcelain that must be washed and stored and inventoried, and served by footmen trained in precise protocols of placement and removal. This is the machinery of empire, not the crown and scepter, not the throne room and the guild, but the endless invisible labor that makes the visible world possible. And nowhere was this machinery more elaborate, more demanding, or more relentlessly expensive than at Schönbrunn, the summer palace that became the nerve center of Habsburg power for nearly 2 centuries. To understand why such a place exists, we must go back before the palace itself, before the gardens and galleries, before even the first foundation stones were laid. We must go back to what the land was before it became a symbol. In the 14th century, the area now occupied by Schönbrunn was unremarkable. Rolling terrain dotted with vineyards and a small mill, fed by a spring whose waters were considered uncommonly pure and pleasant. The name Schönbrunn translates to beautiful spring, and it was this spring that first attracted attention. In 1548, the property was purchased by the mayor of Vienna, who used it as a country estate. It changed hands several times before finding its way into Habsburg possession in 1569, when Emperor Maximilian II acquired it as a hunting ground. For over a century, the Habsburgs used Schönbrunn casually, a place to hunt game, to escape the summer heat of the Hofburg in the city center, to breathe air untainted by the smells of urban life. A hunting lodge stood here, modest by royal standards, surrounded by game parks and pheasantries. It was a retreat, not a residence. It was comfortable, not magnificent. Everything changed in 1683. That year, the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna in one of the most consequential military campaigns in European history. For 2 months, the city held against the assault, its walls battered, its population starving, its future uncertain. When a coalition of Christian forces finally broke the siege in September, Vienna was saved, but Schönbrunn was destroyed. The Ottoman army had camped in its grounds, the hunting lodge was burned, the gardens were trampled, the beautiful spring ran through a landscape of devastation. Emperor Leopold IV, who had fled Vienna during the siege and returned in its aftermath, saw in this destruction an opportunity. The Ottoman threat had been repelled. The Habsburg domains were secure. And Leopold, a man of intense piety, considerable vanity, and an unshakable belief in the divine mandate of his dynasty, wanted a monument to that security. Not merely a hunting lodge rebuilt, but something unprecedented. A summer palace that would rival Versailles itself. A declaration in stone and garden and gilt that the House of Habsburg stood at the apex of European power. He commissioned Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, the leading Baroque architect of the Austrian territories, to design such a palace. Fischer von Erlach's initial proposal was staggering in its ambition. He envisioned a structure that would dwarf the French king's residence, a complex of cascading terraces built into the hillside, crowned by a colonnade of impossible dimensions. It was a fantasy architecture, a fever dream of imperial grandeur that existed more in the realm of propaganda than practical construction. Leopold studied the plans, he admired them, and then he did something that would characterize the Habsburg relationship with Schönbrunn for the next 3 centuries. He scaled them back. The money was not there. The will was not quite sufficient. The original vision was too expensive, too impractical, too divorced from the grinding reality of state finances perpetually strained by war. A more modest palace was approved. Construction began in 1696. Fischer von Erlach's reduced design was still impressive, a 2-story structure of considerable elegance, positioned to take advantage of the rising terrain behind it. But it remained incomplete at Leopold's death in 1705. His successors, Joseph Thurnt and Charles VI, continued work intermittently, constrained always by the competing demands of military campaigns and administrative costs. By the 1740s, Schönbrunn was a palace in potentia, a promise half fulfilled, a vision perpetually deferred. And then came Maria Theresa. She was 23 years old when she inherited the Habsburg domains in 1740, the first woman to rule the house in her own right. Her father, Charles VI, had spent years securing diplomatic agreements, the pragmatic sanction, to ensure that his daughter could inherit. The agreements proved worthless almost immediately. Prussia invaded Silesia. Bavaria challenged her claim. France saw opportunity. Within months of her accession, Maria Theresa found herself fighting for her throne against a coalition of enemies who believed that a young woman could not possibly hold together the patchwork territories of the Habsburg realm. She proved them catastrophically wrong. Maria Theresa possessed qualities that her contemporaries consistently underestimated: a will of iron, a political pragmatism that could be ruthless when circumstances required, and an instinctive understanding of the importance of appearances in maintaining power. She lost Silesia, a blow that would haunt her for the rest of her life, but she kept her crown. She reformed the administration of her domains, centralized tax collection, modernized the military, and produced 16 children to secure the succession. She was in virtually every way a force of nature, and she chose Schönbrunn as her primary summer residence. Her reasons were practical as well as aesthetic. The Hofburg, the Imperial Palace in Vienna's center, was cramped, outdated, and surrounded by the noise and smell of urban life. Schönbrunn offered space for her growing family, space for the elaborate court rituals that Habsburg legitimacy required, space to demonstrate power on a scale befitting the ruler of an empire spanning from the Netherlands to Hungary. But the existing palace was insufficient. It needed expansion. It needed transformation. It needed to become what Fischer von Erlach had originally imagined and what the constraints of reality had prevented. In 1743, Maria Theresa commissioned the architect Nicolaus Picassi to redesign Schönbrunn. What followed was one of the most ambitious building campaigns in Habsburg history. Picassi retained the bones of Fischer von Erlach's structure, but expanded it dramatically. The palace grew from approximately 100 rooms to over 1,400. Its footprint extended outward. A third story was added. Wings were constructed to enclose courtyards. The facade was unified in that distinctive yellow ochre, a color chosen for practical reasons as well as aesthetic ones, as it held up well against weathering and required less frequent repainting than white. The gardens were redesigned in the formal French style, their geometries precise, their sight lines calculated to draw the eye toward focal points and termini. The great Neptune fountain was installed at the base of the hill. The Gloriette was constructed at its summit, a neoclassical arcade serving no practical purpose except to provide a dramatic visual anchor for the entire composition. The numbers alone suggest the scale of what was undertaken. The palace's principal facade stretched to 175 meters. The grand courtyard could accommodate the ceremonial assemblies of an entire court. The gardens required the labor of hundreds of workers to plant, prune, and maintain. The parterres contained over 30,000 flowering plants, changed seasonally to ensure year-round color. The orangery sheltered hundreds of citrus trees and exotic plants, requiring heating throughout the winter months. The menagerie, the world's oldest zoo, established in 1752, housed animals from across the known world, each requiring specialized care and feeding. All of this required infrastructure invisible to the casual observer. Below the palace, a network of tunnels extended outward like the roots of an enormous tree. These tunnels served multiple purposes. They allowed servants to move between different sections of the palace without crossing the paths of their employers. They contained the pipes that brought water from distant sources into the kitchens and baths. They provided access to the heating chambers where the stokers like Johann Meyer labored through the night. They connected storage rooms where food and fuel and linens were stockpiled against future need. The heating system alone was an engineering challenge of the first order. A palace of 1,400 rooms could not be heated by fireplaces alone. The stoves that warmed Schönbrunn were elaborate constructions of tile and iron, designed to maximize heat output while minimizing fuel consumption. Many were fed from adjacent service corridors, allowing stokers to add fuel without entering the rooms themselves. But even these efficiencies could not overcome the fundamental physics of heat loss through walls and windows. During the coldest months, the palace consumed wood at a staggering rate. Entire forests felled, transported, and burned to keep the temperature merely tolerable. Water presented different challenges. The original beautiful spring that gave the property its name was insufficient for the needs of a palace and its gardens. New sources had to be found, aqueducts constructed, pumping systems devised. The fountains that delighted visitors with their displays of water and light required constant pressure, constant maintenance, constant attention to the mechanisms that made them function. When something broke, and something always broke, it had to be repaired quickly, discreetly, without disturbing the illusion of effortless splendor. The kitchen operations defied easy comprehension. The palace could house up to 1,000 people during major court events, not only the imperial family and their guests, but the vast retinue of servants, guards, administrators, and functionaries without whom court life could not function. All of these people needed to eat. The main kitchen occupied a space larger than most urban houses, equipped with multiple hearths, roasting spits, baking ovens, and preparation surfaces where dozens of cooks worked simultaneously. Separate kitchens served specific purposes: pastry kitchens, confectionery kitchens, kitchens dedicated solely to the preparation of coffee and chocolate, cold storage rooms carved into the earth below ground level and packed with ice harvested from frozen ponds, preserved meat and dairy through the warmer months. The supply chains feeding these kitchens stretched across the empire. Meat came from the imperial hunting estates. Fish arrived live in water-filled barrels from distant rivers. Produce was grown in the palace's own gardens when possible, supplemented by purchases from local farmers and imports from southern regions for fruits and vegetables unavailable in Austria's climate. Sugar, chocolate, and coffee came from colonial trade routes, passing through a succession of merchants before reaching the palace stores. Wine-filled cellars that extended for hundreds of meters, stocked with vintages from Hungary, the Rhine, and Austria's own vineyards. Each item had to be purchased, transported, received, inventoried, stored, distributed, prepared, and served. A logistical operation that required dedicated administrative staff simply to track. And then there was the question of people. At its peak during Maria Theresa's reign, Schönbrunn employed well over 1,000 permanent staff. This number expanded dramatically during major court events when temporary workers were hired to supplement the regular course. The hierarchy of service was as rigid and elaborate as the court hierarchy it supported. At the top stood the major domo, responsible for the overall coordination of palace operations. Below him, A complex organization divided responsibility among departments: the table department, the cellar department, the confectionery, the silver service, the linens, the stables, the gardens, the heating, the maintenance. Each department had its own chief, its own budgets, its own traditions and protocols. The servants themselves occupied a social universe invisible to their employers, but no less complex. Senior servants, valets, ladies-in-waiting, chief cooks, might earn salaries comparable to successful merchants and enjoy considerable status within the service hierarchy. Junior servants lived in dormitory conditions, often 6 or 8 to a room, working hours that would be illegal in any modern democracy. The youngest, the kitchen boys, the lamplighters, the ash carriers, were sometimes no more than 10 or 12 years old, inducted into palace service as their fathers and grandfathers had been before them. For them, the palace was not a building to be admired, but a world to be survived, a system of demands and punishments and rewards that shaped their entire existence. Maria Theresa, to her credit, was not entirely blind to the human reality beneath her feet. She was, by the standards of her era, a reformer, concerned with the welfare of her subjects in ways that extended beyond mere productivity. She issued regulations governing the treatment of servants, limited certain abuses, and made genuine efforts to ensure that the laborers who maintained her world were not entirely forgotten. But she was also, inescapably, a product of her class and time. The fundamental arrangement, splendor above, labor below, the former dependent upon the latter yet carefully separated from it, was never questioned. It was simply the natural order, as permanent as the turning of the seasons. The financial reality of maintaining this natural order was staggering. Accurate records from the 18th century are incomplete, but surviving accounts suggest that the annual operating cost of Schönbrunn consumed a substantial portion of the Habsburg court budget. This budget was not, as modern observers might assume, a discretionary allowance for luxury. It was a political necessity. The display of wealth was not vanity. It was statecraft. A monarch who could not maintain a magnificent court was a monarch whose power could be questioned, whose alliances might waver, whose subjects might wonder whether the crown truly commanded divine favor. The cost of maintaining Schönbrunn was, in this calculus, the cost of maintaining legitimacy itself. But costs have a way of outrunning justifications. The palace required constant attention. Baroque architecture, for all its beauty, was not designed for durability. The elaborate stucco work of the facades cracked and crumbled, requiring regular replacement. The gilding in the staterooms tarnished and flaked. The frescoes faded. The wooden floors warped and splintered. The mechanical systems, the heating apparatus, the water pipes, the kitchen equipment wore out and needed upgrading. Every decade brought new expenses that had not been anticipated, new repairs that could not be deferred, new crises that demanded immediate attention and immediate funds. Maria Theresa attempted various expedients to control costs. She consolidated administrative functions, eliminated redundant positions, imposed efficiencies where possible. But she was also fighting against the expansive logic of imperial display. A court that economized too visibly was a court that invited contempt. A palace that appeared shabby was a palace that suggested weakness. The balance between fiscal prudence and political necessity was delicate, and it tilted repeatedly toward expenditure. Her successors faced the same tensions with less skill. Joseph II, who became sole ruler upon Maria Theresa's death in 1780, possessed his mother's intelligence but little of her political instinct. He was an Enlightenment monarch, devoted to reform, impatient with tradition, contemptuous of display for its own sake. He reduced the staff at Schönbrunn. He opened parts of the palace gardens to the public, believing that beautiful spaces should serve the common good rather than the private pleasures of monarchy. He questioned the fundamental premise that imperial power required imperial splendor. His reforms, however well-intentioned, proved destabilizing. The nobility resented the erosion of their privileges. The church resisted his intrusions into ecclesiastical matters. His subjects, accustomed to a certain relationship with the crown, found themselves disoriented by a monarch who seemed to reject the very basis of his own authority. Joseph died in 1790, exhausted and largely unsuccessful, his radical vision diluted or reversed by his successors. The French Revolution, erupting the year before Joseph's death, cast a long shadow over the subsequent decades. The spectacle of a monarch executed, an aristocracy destroyed, a social order overturned, this haunted the courts of Europe and created new imperatives for display. The Habsburgs, under Leopold II and then Franz II, faced the challenge of maintaining royal legitimacy in an age when legitimacy itself had become contestable. Schönbrunn became not merely a residence, but a symbol, a statement that the old order endured, that the splendor of monarchy remained undimmed despite the revolutionary fires burning across the continent. This symbolism came at a price. The Napoleonic Wars that consumed Europe from the 1790s through 1815 drained Habsburg coffers relentlessly. Armies had to be raised, equipped, supplied, and all too frequently replaced after devastating defeats. The empire's territories shrank and expanded with each treaty, each campaign, each shifting alliance. Through it all, Schönbrunn had to be maintained. The gardens had to bloom, the state rooms had to gleam. The illusion of eternal stability had to be preserved even as the ground shifted beneath it. Napoleon himself occupied Schönbrunn twice, in 1805 following his victory at Austerlitz, and again in 1809 after Wagram. These occupations were humiliations of the deepest order. The French emperor slept in the very rooms where Maria Theresa had held court, issued decrees from the desk where Habsburg policy had been formulated, walked through gardens designed to demonstrate Habsburg power to visitors, now forcibly reminded of that power's limits. When the Habsburgs finally prevailed in the coalition against Napoleon, when Franz I presided over the Congress of Vienna that redrew the map of Europe, Schönbrunn served as one of the stages upon which the drama of restoration was performed. Banquets and balls and diplomatic receptions demonstrated that the old order had survived, that legitimacy had triumphed, that the world had been set right. But survival had come at tremendous cost. The post-war Habsburg Empire was financially exhausted. The reforms necessary to modernize were repeatedly deferred in favor of political stability. The bureaucracy that maintained the empire grew ever more elaborate, ever more expensive, ever more resistant to change. Schönbrunn continued to function as a summer residence, but the scale of court life contracted. The great events became rarer. The permanent staff diminished. Economies that would have been unthinkable in Maria Theresa's time became the norm under Franz I and his successors. Franz Joseph I, who came to the throne in 1848 amid revolution and would reign until 1916, the longest rule in Habsburg history, embodied this tension between splendor and economy in his very person. He was born at Schönbrunn and would die there, 86 years of age, having witnessed his empire transform and eventually dissolve. His relationship with the palace was intimate, quotidian, almost domestic. He did not use Schönbrunn for grand displays of power, but as a working residence, a place where the business of empire was conducted with methodical discipline. Franz Joseph rose before dawn each day, worked at his desk for hours before breakfast, received ministers and petitioners in audiences scheduled with mechanical precision, and retired early in the evening. He slept on a simple iron bed, ate modest meals, and disdained the elaborate entertainments his ancestors had cultivated. The court under his rule became famous for its rigidity, its adherence to protocol, its strange combination of grandeur and austerity. Schönbrunn staterooms were maintained. They had to be maintained for diplomatic purposes, but Franz Joseph himself preferred the smaller private apartments where the ceilings were lower and the decor less overwhelming. His wife, Elizabeth, the legendary Sisi, found Schönbrunn suffocating. She was a free spirit trapped in the most elaborately choreographed court in Europe, a woman who craved movement and solitude, confined to an existence of endless ceremony. She escaped whenever possible, traveling restlessly across Europe, building retreats far from Vienna where she could breathe. Her absences became legendary, as did her beauty, her eccentricities, and her final tragedy, murdered by an anarchist in Geneva in 1898. Their son, Crown Prince Rudolf, found Schönbrunn oppressive in different ways. A liberal temperament trapped in a conservative court, an intellect unsuited to the narrowness of his prescribed role, Rudolf died at Meierling in 1889 in circumstances that remain clouded by mystery and cover-up. The official explanation was suicide, but the silences surrounding the death spoke louder than any explanation. Whatever the truth, the loss devastated Franz Joseph and cast a pall over the final decades of his reign. Through all of this, through the personal tragedies and political crises, through wars lost and territories ceded, through the slow erosion of Habsburg power in an age of nationalism and industrialization, Schönbrunn had to be maintained. The fundamental machinery continued to function. The gardens bloomed each spring. The heating systems groaned into operation each winter. The staff, reduced but still substantial, went about their routines. The cost of normalcy remained, even as the resources to meet that cost became ever more constrained. The empire attempted various adaptations. Portions of the palace were open to paying visitors as early as the 19th century, generating modest revenue while satisfying public curiosity about royal life. The gardens, long accessible to the Viennese public thanks to Joseph II's reforms, became a public park in all but name, maintained now for citizens as much as sovereigns. Agricultural lands associated with the estate were rationalized, sold, or leased to generate income. The vast hunting grounds were reduced. The stables contracted. The menagerie evolved from private amusement to public attraction. These adaptations acknowledged implicitly a truth that would have been unthinkable to Maria Theresa, that the palace could not survive on imperial funds alone, that it needed the public, that the relationship between crown and people was not merely symbolic but economic. The people who visited Schönbrunn's gardens, who paid small fees to glimpse the state rooms, who purchased postcards and mementos, these people were keeping the palace alive. Their coins and banknotes joined the dwindling streams of imperial allocation to form the current on which Schönbrunn floated. But larger changes were coming. The First World War, which began in 1914 with the assassination of Franz Joseph's nephew and heir, ended not only the war but the empire itself. Franz Joseph died in 1916, still at war, still holding together by sheer will a realm that would not survive him. His successor, Karl I, reigned for barely 2 years before the end came. In November 1918, With the war lost and the empire dissolving into its constituent nations, Karl signed a document at Schönbrunn renouncing his participation in Austrian state affairs. Not quite an abdication, technically, but functionally the end of 6 centuries of Habsburg rule. The palace that had been designed to proclaim imperial permanence became, overnight, a relic. The new Austrian Republic faced immediate questions about what to do with Schönbrunn. For radicals, the palace was a symbol of oppression, a monument to inequality that should be destroyed or repurposed beyond recognition. For conservatives, it was a national treasure requiring preservation. For pragmatists, it was simply an enormous maintenance liability at a time when the new state could barely function. The pragmatists won, as they often do in moments of crisis. Schönbrunn was nationalized, its contents inventoried, its status transformed from private royal residence to public property. Some of its apartments were converted to residences for government officials or divided into smaller units to address Vienna's post-war housing shortage. Other portions became museums, open to the paying public as the staterooms had been for decades. The gardens remained public, their upkeep funded by tax revenues that the struggling republic could barely spare. The interwar years were difficult. Inflation devastated Austrian finances in the early 1920s, making maintenance budgets nearly meaningless as prices changed faster than allocations could be adjusted. Political instability prevented consistent policy toward cultural preservation. The staff contracted further, and deferred maintenance accumulated. Paint peeled, gardens grew less immaculate, the machinery of Splendor ran on reduced fuel. Then came the Anschluss of 1938, when Nazi Germany absorbed Austria into the Third Reich. Schönbrunn became, briefly, the property of a German state that had little interest in Habsburg symbolism, but considerable interest in cultural prestige. Some restoration work was undertaken during these years, though records are incomplete and motivations complex. The palace survived the Second World War physically intact, a rare mercy in a city that suffered extensive bombing and sustained significant destruction during the final Soviet assault in 1945. The post-war years brought new challenges. Austria, occupied and divided, was poor and traumatized. Schönbrunn, like much of the country's cultural heritage, suffered from neglect. The resources for proper conservation simply did not exist. What maintenance occurred was minimal, reactive, focused on preventing immediate collapse rather than comprehensive preservation. For decades, the palace slowly deteriorated, its fabric weakening, its grandeur fading into shabbiness. Recovery came gradually. Austria's post-war prosperity, built on tourism, neutrality, and careful diplomacy, eventually generated resources for cultural preservation. International recognition of Schönbrunn's significance, culminating in UNESCO World Heritage designation in 1996, created both obligations and opportunities. The palace could no longer be allowed to decay, but decay could only be prevented through sustained investment. The question of where that investment would come from became increasingly urgent. The modern solution represents a fundamental transformation in how places like Schönbrunn can survive. In 1992, the Austrian government established a new entity, Schloss Schönbrunn Kultur- und Betriebsgesellschaft MBH, a limited liability company wholly owned by the Republic of Austria, but operating on commercial principles. The palace was not privatized in the sense of being sold to private investors, but it was corporatized, expected to generate revenue sufficient to cover its operating costs, with any surplus reinvested in preservation and improvement. This arrangement demanded a wholesale rethinking of what Schönbrunn was and how it functioned. The palace became, frankly, a business. Its product was the visitor experience, the opportunity to walk through the staterooms, to wander the gardens, to glimpse the world of the Habsburgs and imagine what life had been like when emperors and empresses moved through these spaces. The challenge was to make that experience compelling enough that millions of people would pay for it, while preserving the authenticity that made it worth experiencing in the first place. The numbers that now define Schönbrunn are commercial as well as historical. Approximately 4 million visitors pass through the palace grounds each year, with around 2 million paying for tours of the interior. Peak summer days can see 15,000 or more visitors, creating crowd management challenges that would have been unimaginable to the palace's original designers. Revenue streams include ticket sales, audio guide rentals, concert fees, special event bookings, restaurant and cafe operations, and an extensive retail program selling everything from postcards to porcelain reproductions. This revenue must cover not only daily operations, but the endless work of conservation. The Schönbrunn yellow that unifies the palace's facades requires regular repainting, a cycle of approximately every 15 years at costs running into the millions of euros each time. The gilded interiors demand attention from specialized craftsmen using techniques little changed since the 18th century, working with gold leaf and traditional adhesives that must be sourced and applied with painstaking precision. The gardens consume the labor of a permanent horticultural staff of several dozen, supplemented by seasonal workers during the intensive planting and maintenance periods of spring and autumn. The heating systems, finally modernized with central heating in the 20th century, must be maintained and periodically replaced. The fountains require pump systems, water treatment, and constant attention to prevent failure during the visitor season when their operation is essential to the experience. The total annual budget for Schönbrunn's operation runs to tens of millions of euros. Approximately 70% of this comes from earned revenue, ticket sales, and commercial operations, with the remainder provided through government subsidies, cultural grants, and occasional special allocations for major projects. This ratio represents a precarious balance. Any significant decline in tourism, whether from economic recession, pandemic, changing travel patterns, or simply shifting tourist preferences, threatens the entire financial model. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 demonstrated this vulnerability starkly, as visitor numbers collapsed and the palace, like cultural institutions worldwide, faced existential financial pressure. The staff required to operate modern Schönbrunn numbers around 500 people, substantially fewer than in Imperial days, but still representing one of the largest cultural institution workforces in Austria. These employees include security personnel, tour guides and visitor services staff, conservators and craftsmen, gardeners and groundskeepers, administrators and marketers, event coordinators, and retail workers. Many are direct employees of the management company. Others work for contracted service providers. The hierarchy is flatter than in imperial times, the relationships more regulated by labor law and union agreements. But the fundamental reality that the palace can only function through coordinated human effort remains unchanged. Technology has transformed some aspects of operation while leaving others stubbornly traditional. Climate control systems now maintain precise temperature and humidity levels in sensitive areas, preventing the damage that fluctuating conditions would cause to furniture, textiles, and paintings. Security systems employ cameras, sensors, and digital monitoring. Ticketing and crowd management use sophisticated software to predict and respond to visitor flows. But the work of conservation itself The repair of gilding, the restoration of fabrics, the maintenance of wooden floors still requires human hands trained in skills passed down through generations. There are no robots that can reweave 18th century silk or match the patina of antique bronze. The gardens present their own blend of tradition and modernity. The parterres are still planted with seasonal flowers, their patterns changed multiple times each year to maintain visual interest. The Great Palm House, constructed in the mid-19th century and requiring extensive restoration in recent decades, shelters tropical species that must be heated year-round at considerable energy cost. The maze and privy garden draw visitors seeking the specifically designed experience of baroque garden culture. The wider landscape grounds function as public parkland, maintained for recreation as much as for historical presentation. The commercial activities that help fund all of this represent compromises that earlier custodians might have found uncomfortable. The Orangery now hosts concerts, including the heavily tourist-targeted Schönbrunn Palace concerts that offer Mozart and Strauss to visitors seeking authentic Viennese musical experiences. The Old Court Bakery sells pastries to tourists. Wedding ceremonies take place in rooms where emperors once granted audiences. Corporate events occupy spaces designed for state functions. Each of these uses generates revenue essential to the palace's survival, but each also represents a negotiation between historical preservation and contemporary commercial realities. The question of authenticity haunts all such negotiations. When a palace becomes a museum becomes a tourist attraction, and a tourist attraction becomes a business. What remains of the original meaning? The rooms through which visitors now walk were designed not for observation, but for living, for the actual conduct of imperial life in all its mundane and ceremonial aspects. The furniture that survives was arranged for use, not display. The art on the walls was intended to communicate messages to contemporaries who shared the cultural vocabulary necessary to understand them. By turning these spaces into exhibits, something essential is inevitably lost, even as something is preserved. Modern conservation philosophy grapples with these questions without fully resolving them. The current approach at Schönbrunn emphasizes maintenance and stabilization over dramatic restoration. The goal is not to return the palace to some imagined perfect state, but to preserve what exists, to slow the processes of decay, to allow future generations to make their own decisions about what is valuable and how it should be treated. This means accepting imperfection, the faded colors, the worn floors, the patched repairs visible if one knows where to look. It means acknowledging that the palace is not frozen in time, but exists in time, accumulating layers of history even as it tries to present a historical moment. The heating that now warms Schönbrunn's rooms comes not from stokers in basement corridors, but from a modern central heating system, its fuel delivered by truck and its operation monitored by computer. But the fundamental challenge, keeping thousands of cubic meters of interior space at temperatures comfortable for human occupation, despite the heat-hungry mass of stone and plaster surrounding it, remains essentially unchanged. The physics of heat loss does not respect technological progress. Modern systems are more efficient than their predecessors, but they still consume energy, still generate costs, still require maintenance and eventual replacement. In the gardens, mechanical equipment has replaced much manual labor, but the work of cultivation remains labor-intensive in ways that no technology has eliminated. Plants must be selected, planted, watered, pruned, and replaced according to rhythms that machinery can assist but not supplant. The great hedges that define the garden's geometry require regular trimming by workers who must understand both the horticultural requirements and the aesthetic intentions being served. The fountain's mechanical systems demand expertise that combines historical knowledge with contemporary engineering. The administration of all this complexity occupies a suite of offices within the palace complex, staffed by professionals who manage budgets, personnel, marketing, conservation planning, visitor services, regulatory compliance, and the endless negotiations with government agencies, preservation authorities, and commercial partners that keep the enterprise functioning. These administrators are the inheritors of the major domos and stewards who once ran the palace for imperial masters, though their degrees are in business and heritage management rather than service to the crown. Financial sustainability remains an unresolved question. The current model depends on high visitor numbers, robust tourism spending, and continued government willingness to provide subsidizing support. Any of these factors could change. Climate change may alter travel patterns or impose new costs for building protection. Economic shifts could reduce disposable income for cultural tourism. Political changes could redirect cultural funding toward other priorities. The pandemic demonstrated how quickly the revenue base could collapse. Recovery has occurred, but vulnerabilities have been exposed. More fundamentally, the question of who pays for the past remains philosophically contested. Should Austrian taxpayers indefinitely subsidize the maintenance of a Habsburg palace, remnant of a dynasty that no longer rules? Should international visitors bear the burden through ticket prices, essentially taxing their curiosity to preserve something they did not create and do not own? Should commercial exploitation be expanded to generate more revenue, even at the cost of further compromising historical integrity? These questions have no definitive answers, only provisional ones that each generation must reconsider. The machinery of empire has been replaced by the machinery of heritage tourism, a different kind of machine, operating according to different principles, but machinery nonetheless. The underground corridors where Johann Meyer once stoked the fires now house electrical conduits and mechanical systems. The kitchens where armies of cooks prepared imperial banquets now serve tourists in special events. The service hierarchy that organized thousands of workers has been replaced by organizational charts and HR departments. But the fundamental reality that a place of this scale and complexity can only exist through continuous coordinated effort remains unchanged. What Schönbrunn represents, ultimately, is the accumulated labor of generations made visible in stone and garden and gilt, not just the labor of the architects and artists whose names are recorded, but the labor of the anonymous thousands, the stokers and gardeners, the cooks and servants, the craftsmen and maintenance workers, whose names are forgotten, but whose work made the visible beauty possible. The palace is not merely the product of imperial ambition, it is the product of human effort on a scale that defies easy comprehension. To walk through Schönbrunn today is to walk through that accumulated labor. Every surface has been created, maintained, repaired, and preserved by human hands. Every garden bed has been planted and replanted countless times across 3 centuries. Every gilded molding has been cleaned, retouched, and conserved by workers whose skill and patience were essential to the survival of the whole. The beauty that visitors admire is not natural beauty, but made beauty, sustained beauty, beauty that exists only because someone has decided it should exist and committed the resources and effort to make that decision reality. This is the truth that empires preferred to hide, and that tourism sometimes obscures, that splendor has costs, that magnificence requires maintenance, that the apparently permanent is actually perpetually constructed. The palace that seems to exist outside of time actually exists within time, subject to decay and entropy like everything else, preserved only through continuous resistance to those forces. Its survival is not automatic or guaranteed. It is achieved day by day, year by year, through decisions and investments that could always be made differently. The question that Maria Theresa never asked, because her class and era made such questions unthinkable, is the question that modern custodians cannot avoid. Is it worth it? Are the resources consumed by Schönbrunn's preservation justified by what is preserved? Could that money, that labor, that energy be better spent elsewhere? What claims do the dead have on the living? What obligations does beauty impose? These questions do not have simple answers. The palace represents not only aesthetic achievement, but historical evidence, not only Habsburg propaganda, but European heritage, not only elite culture, but the labor and skill of generations of workers whose contributions deserve remembrance. To let Schönbrunn decay would be to lose something irreplaceable, a record of human capacity, human ambition, and human folly that cannot be reproduced once lost. But to preserve it requires ongoing sacrifices that must be continuously renewed, resources that must be continuously directed, decisions that must be continuously justified. The stoker Johann Meyer, climbing those basement stairs in the darkness of a winter morning in 1756, knew nothing of UNESCO World Heritage status or tourism economics or conservation philosophy. He knew only that the fires needed feeding, that the palace required warmth, that his labor was necessary for a world he never fully saw to continue functioning. 270 years later, his successors, the technicians and gardeners, the conservators and guides, the administrators and managers, are engaged in essentially the same task. They keep the fires burning, metaphorically speaking. They maintain the machine that maintains the beauty, that maintains the memory of an empire that no longer exists. The yellow facade glows in the afternoon light, its ochre warmth unchanged from Maria Theresa's day. The fountains dance in the gardens below, their jets precisely calibrated, their pumps humming beneath the surface. Tourists from 6 continents walk the paths that emperors once walked, taking photographs, buying souvenirs, experiencing something that money alone could not create, but that money alone keeps from disappearing. Somewhere in the administrative offices, staff review next year's budget projections, calculating the gap between anticipated revenue and anticipated costs, deciding what can be funded and what must be deferred. The machinery continues. It has not stopped for 3 centuries. It will not stop until someone decides it should, or until the resources to keep it running are no longer available, or until circumstances beyond anyone's control force an end that no one chose. This is the reality behind the beauty, the cost behind the splendor, the daily labor that makes the eternal possible. Schönbrunn endures not because it is old or beautiful or important, but because each day people decide it should endure and do the work to make that decision real. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It demands service. It requires compromise. It exists only through the continuous effort of those willing to bear its weight, to pay its costs, to keep its fires burning through the long dark hours when no one is watching and no one is applauding, and the work is simply the work, necessary and endless and essential. The palace waits in the darkness. The morning will come. The visitors will arrive. and the machinery will turn another day, as it has for centuries, as it may for centuries more. If the resources hold, if the will persists, if the world continues to believe that some things are worth the cost of keeping. What invisible labor sustains the beauty you admire, and who bears the cost of keeping the magnificent alive?